On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Riverigo, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Françoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Françoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Françoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Françoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Françoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Françoise, like, what do you mean? Like, what's the issue? But Françoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Françoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club? But Françoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Françoise, like, hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Like, is that really the reason you're leaving? And Françoise just said, yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go. But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Françoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned this is happening so quickly. And then Françoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Françoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Françoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Françoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends. And Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Françoise could reasonably get together. But Françoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Françoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work? And she promised she would actually be home when he got there so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Françoise saw Yves' shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, you know what? I'd really, really like that. And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Yves finished getting dressed, he asked Françoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Yves was ready to leave, Françoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Françoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen, and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. there were 2 blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but he couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside, he saw very clearly there were 2 severed arms and the lower part of 2 legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these 2 bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only 1 day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this, because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Those 2 things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron. who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Francoise, the caller hung up. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Francoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Francoise Gendron, and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days. And he was starting to get worried about Francoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Francoise really did live in that apartment and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Francoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, no drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. And then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Francoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, like the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot. And two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. Like, she could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, and then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim. But for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to Francoise Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like, you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now, at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son, who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also, he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Yves was there, to tell Yves that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francoise Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking, and apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, he asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc, and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michel and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michel and Luc. And he sat down across from her and he basically said, look, we know you're connected to the two men, Michel and Luc, and also to Francoise, and we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know. And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michel and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michel was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michel was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michel if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michel said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michel, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michel saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michel, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michel, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michel for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, well, the body belonged to Françoise Gendron. When Michel heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, "Michel, did you kill Françoise?" And Michel, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Françoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michel's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Françoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Françoise's apartment. Françoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in, and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Françoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Françoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Françoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walk their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Françoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Françoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Françoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Françoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Françoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Françoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Françoise's head under the water, and again, Françoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. Then the killer grabbed a nearby scalpel, reached into the tub, and cut each of Françoise's wrists. And then Françoise just laid in the tub and bled out. After Françoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub and then cut Françoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces of her limbs and torso and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Françoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Françoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home and they put it in the oven and they cooked it overnight. So the skull would then become soft enough that they could crush it with a hammer. And then after smashing up Françoise's head, they would flush Françoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Françoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Francoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Francoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Francoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Francoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Francoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Francoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. This episode is called The Shining. On a Monday morning in August of 1917, 19-year-old Molly Maggia and her older sister, Albina, walked to their new jobs in the small city of Orange, New Jersey. Molly and Albina didn't really look like sisters. Molly was tall and had smooth brown hair, while Albina was an entire foot shorter and kept her own brown curls covered with a hat. But that morning, they had something in common. They were both so excited for work that they were practically bouncing along the sidewalk. A few weeks earlier, Molly and her sister had seen an advertisement for jobs at a local studio, where employees helped create one of the most fashionable items of the era: watches that glowed in the dark. This particular advertisement was looking for women who could hand paint the tiny glow-in-the-dark numbers and hands on the watch faces. And this was really exciting for Molly and Albina, because there weren't many job opportunities out there for women. At the time, women typically got stuck working in dangerous factories for extremely low wages. But this job was different. It seemed interesting and artistic, and it paid really well. Plus, it sounded glamorous, because they wouldn't have to work in a dirty factory. Instead, they'd work in a clean, well-maintained studio. Molly knew that lots of women wanted these positions, but she and her sister applied anyway, and amazingly, they both got hired. Molly was ecstatic. Not only had she landed this amazing job, but she got to go to work every day with her big sister. She'd been looking forward to their first day at work ever since. Molly turned a corner and saw the studio building. The sisters walked up and knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a middle-aged woman wearing a plaid dress answered. She introduced herself as the studio's forewoman and led them inside. And when Molly walked into this building, she was amazed by what she saw. Dozens of these women were sitting in rows, paintbrushes in hand, dipping them into this glowing powder and then applying them to the watch face over and over and over again. They were working so quickly, it was like their hands were this glowing blur. The more Molly watched, the more excited she was to be one of these women. However, just then, the forewoman told Molly and her sister that they wouldn't actually be painting that day. Before they ever touched a brush, they had to learn what a well-painted watch looked like. The forewoman led Molly and her sister past the sparkling painters and into a totally different room. There, Molly saw a handful of young women inspecting watch faces that had already been painted. Now, Molly was not very excited about doing quality control, but she knew this was a necessary step towards becoming a full-time watch painter. The forewoman introduced Molly and her sister to the inspector who'd be training them. Her name was Catherine Schaub. The forewoman explained that Catherine was just 15 years old and had only been working at the studio for about 6 months. However, in that time, She'd worked her way up from being an apprentice to a painter and now an instructor. The forewoman told Molly and her sister that they too could be like Catherine if they worked hard enough. Then she left and headed back out to the main studio. After she was gone, Catherine began showing Molly and Albina the ropes. Molly watched as Catherine spread a few circular paper watch faces out on the table. Catherine explained that each watch face was pre-printed, so the paper was black and the numbers were white. Painters would then go over the white numbers with the glow-in-the-dark paint. But it was really important that none of the paint went outside the lines. Otherwise, the whole thing would have to be thrown out. And so for the next several days, Molly and her sister inspected watch faces, and Catherine would then check their work. Once they'd both gotten the hang of spotting imperfections, Catherine told them it was time to learn how to paint. This was what Molly had been waiting for. She was so excited. She watched as Catherine demonstrated how to mix water and glue together to create the liquid base for the paint. She explained that they would dip their brushes into the liquid, then into the glow-in-the-dark powder, and then use that to paint. Next, Catherine showed Molly and her sister the paintbrushes they'd be using, and Molly couldn't believe how tiny they were. Each one was made out of wood and camel hair. The handle was incredibly thin, and the brush itself was made of just 30 hairs. However, Catherine warned them that even though the brush appeared to look very sharp, the bristles often would spread the more it was used, causing the paint to kind of go outside of the lines. And so Catherine told them to always make sure they kept the tip of their brush very sharp before making a stroke. Molly nodded, grabbed a paintbrush, and started practicing. A few weeks later, Molly sat down amongst the rows of women in the main studio, painting one watch face after another. While her sister Albina was still struggling to get the hang of painting, Molly had quickly proven that she was a natural artist and had been promoted to full-time painter very quickly. She would get paid for every watch face that she completed without error, so she made sure to work really fast. Molly was so good at her job that she could actually paint and socialize at the same time without slowing down at all. So, as she painted that day, she also gossiped and cracked jokes with the young woman who sat across from her, whose name was Ella Eckert. Molly had actually been kind of intimidated by her when they first met, but now they were like best friends. And so as Molly slid a finished watch face to the side and grabbed a new one, Ella leaned across the table and said she wanted to show her something. Molly watched as Ella dipped her paintbrush into the glow-in-the-dark powder, but then instead of painting a watch, she began painting her own fingernails. Ella painted each nail on her right hand, and then held up her hand and wiggled her fingers to show Molly. Even in the brightly lit studio, Ella's fingernails glowed beautifully. It was like the most amazing, expensive-looking nail polish Molly had ever seen. So Molly started painting her nails too, and the next thing she knew, other women in the studio were doing the same thing. Four years later, in 1921, Molly showed up for another day of painting watches at the studio. And she felt especially lucky to be there because over the past 4 years, this company she worked for had changed hands and downsized. And so a lot of women were laid off, and some had to quit to find other work, including her sister Albina. Because Molly was one of the very best painters there, she'd managed to keep her job. That day, after walking into the main studio, Molly waved at a few coworkers and smiled, and then sat down and got to work. The repetitive movement of dipping the brush in the powder and then painting the watch over and over and over again was sort of like meditation. Molly kind of zoned out as she did it. But on this day, she suddenly felt the sharp pain inside of her mouth. Molly winced. She'd had a tooth pulled a few weeks ago after getting a really bad toothache, and the spot where it used to be had not healed well. She kept accidentally pressing on it with her tongue and making it hurt even worse. Molly shook off this new pain and went back to work. She painted a big stack of watch faces and then stood up to bring them to the studio's forewoman. But as she was walking over, her tongue flicked back to the sore spot on her gums, and she winced again. Molly knew she was making the pain worse, but she couldn't stop herself from messing with the sore. It should have healed by now, which made her think that maybe the dentist didn't know what he was doing. She told herself that if this sore did not get any better, she would have to go see a different dentist. A month later, in October of 1921, the sore in Molly's mouth was still there, so she did go and find a new dentist. She walked into his office, and she met this tall, middle-aged man with big glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Joseph Neff. then led her back to an exam room and asked what had brought her in that day. Molly explained that about 2 months ago, she'd gotten a toothache and had one tooth removed, but her gums never healed, and ever since, the pain in her mouth had only gotten worse. It had spread all the way across her gums and into her lower jaw. Molly told Dr. Neff that she suspected her first dentist had actually done something wrong to cause all of this pain, and so she was really hoping that he, this new dentist, would be able to fix that. Dr. Neff nodded, then leaned Molly back and asked her to open up her mouth. He used a metal tool to prod at her teeth, and after only a few moments, he told Molly that her gums looked very swollen and several of her teeth were loose. Molly was immediately terrified and said she didn't want to lose any more teeth, but Dr. Neff assured her that would not happen. He said her pain had nothing to do with the first dentist that she saw. Instead, she had a common condition called periodontitis, which is a gum disease caused by bacteria. As soon as they got the bacteria out of her mouth, her gums would heal, and she would feel much better. So Dr. Neff gave Molly a special antibacterial mouthwash, and then she was on her way feeling very optimistic. A few weeks later, in November, Molly sat in the main studio painting and tried to focus on her work. A few of her coworkers were gossiping and laughing beside her, but Molly was in so much pain that nothing felt funny to her anymore. She didn't even want to open her mouth to laugh, because then everyone would see that she was missing multiple teeth. Her smile, which she used to think was one of her best features, was now full of holes. Dr. Neff had promised her that she would not lose any more teeth, but that had not been true. Even though Molly had been using the antibacterial mouthwash exactly as instructed, her condition only got worse. Her gums continued swelling and her teeth got looser and looser until eventually they just started falling out. And every time Molly lost a tooth, a painful ulcer formed where the tooth used to be. So her gums were extremely swollen, all of her teeth were either loose or missing, and her mouth was full of these horrible, painful sores. Molly had been back to Dr. Neff's office multiple times, but all he'd been able to do was prescribe painkillers. He couldn't actually figure out what was happening to her teeth, let alone figure out how to stop it. And as if the situation wasn't bad enough, over the last few days, Molly had noticed that her breath smelled horrible. No matter how many times she brushed her teeth or used mouthwash, the smell just would not go away. Molly didn't know what to do. She used to feel totally at home in the watch painting studio, but now she felt totally alone. The next day, Dr. Neff was at his dental office when he heard the front door open. He looked over and saw Molly, and she looked like she'd been crying. She told him that she was in so much pain that she'd had to quit her job. She really just needed to know what was going on with her. Dr. Neff quickly ushered her back to an exam room, leaned her back in a chair, and took a look at her few remaining teeth. And almost immediately, he noticed the awful smell coming out of Molly's mouth. As a dental professional, Dr. Neff actually recognized this scent. It was not typical bad breath. It was the smell of Molly's teeth rotting inside of her mouth. By this point, Dr. Neff knew his original diagnosis of a bacterial infection just had to be wrong. He thought over all of Molly's symptoms: swollen gums, painful ulcers that wouldn't heal, and now rotting teeth. And at first, he just couldn't make sense of them all. But then, Dr. Neff had an idea. To him, Molly's symptoms seemed very similar to a condition dentists sometimes called phossy jaw, which caused swelling, sores, toothaches, and the gradual death of the teeth and jawbones. Phossy was short for phosphorus, and the condition was caused by phosphorus poisoning. It was most common amongst people who worked in factories that manufactured products using phosphorus, like matches. So Dr. Neff asked Molly what she did for work. She explained to him that she used to be a watch painter before she'd had to quit. Dr. Neff asked her if the paint that they were using contained phosphorus, and Molly said she had no idea. Dr. Neff explained his theory to Molly, and then told her he would go over to the watch studio himself to follow up. So, after their appointment was over, he went to the studio and actually spoke to the forewoman, and she would tell the dentist there was definitely no phosphorus in the paint. Dr. Neff sighed. He was back at square one. About 6 months later, in May of 1922, Dr. Neff led Molly to an exam room for yet another dental appointment. He still had not been able to determine what was wrong with her, but every time she came into his office, she looked worse than before. That day, Molly limped towards the exam chair and slowly lowered herself into the seat. She said another doctor had diagnosed her with rheumatism in her hips and feet, which basically meant that her bones and joints ached all the time. Dr. Neff looked at Molly. She was only 24 years old, but it was like her whole body was disintegrating. He didn't know what to say, but he still held on to hope that he might be able to diagnose and treat her. So he leaned Molly back in the chair and asked her to open up her mouth. But when she did, she immediately winced and pointed at her jaw. Dr. Neff used his fingers to feel around her cheek and jawbone on the outside, but despite how gentle he was being, he literally heard her jawbone crack. When he reached into her mouth, he literally picked up a chunk of her lower jaw and pulled it right out. Dr. Neff was so shocked he was just frozen for a moment, holding Molly's broken bone in his hand. She looked at him, clearly afraid, confused, and in horrible pain. But all Dr. Neff could do was give her more pain medication and tell her, come back if anything changes. And a week later, Molly did come back. She told Dr. Neff the pain in her jaw was absolutely unbearable, even with the pain medication. And so once again, Dr. Neff reached into her mouth to examine her, except this time, what was left of her lower jaw just disintegrated into his hands. Dr. Neff was horrified. Whatever was wrong with Molly, he didn't know if it was something he could even fix, and so he arranged to have her sent straight to the hospital. A month later, in June, Dr. Neff was back at his office doing what he did a lot these days, thinking about Molly. He knew hospital doctors had done their best to fix and stitch up her face, but Molly was now left so disfigured because of her jaw disintegrating that she rarely left her apartment anymore, because people would just stare and point at her. On top of that, Dr. Neff knew that Molly was still in constant, debilitating pain, no matter what pain meds she was on. Dr. Neff knew he couldn't give Molly her jaw back, but he kept thinking that if he could just come up with a diagnosis, he might at least be able to lessen her pain. So he thought about her symptoms, her job, her lifestyle as a young, unmarried woman who lived alone. And suddenly he had an idea. What if Molly had syphilis? Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that can cause painful ulcers and body aches. But Dr. Neff thought maybe it could cause other symptoms, like bone decay. He wanted to test Molly for syphilis, but in the 1920s, there was a huge stigma around syphilis in the United States. People who contracted the infection, especially unmarried women, were seen as dirty and immoral. The stigma was so severe that Dr. Neff didn't even want to bring up the possibility to Molly that she might have syphilis in fear of offending her. So he decided he would do the test secretly. The next time Molly visited his office, he told her he wanted to take a blood sample to test, but he didn't say why. And Molly, who was just so desperate to figure out what was going on with her, said that was fine. And so after she left and Dr. Neff had the blood sample, he tested it for syphilis. And sure enough, her blood came back positive for the infection. Finally, he had an answer for all of Molly's symptoms. However, it wasn't as simple as calling her back to the office and giving her medication, because at the time, there were no effective treatments for syphilis. Dr. Neff couldn't do anything to help her, and he figured if Molly knew she had syphilis, which was so stigmatized, she'd be overcome with shame. So Dr. Neff decided not to tell her or her family at all. Three months later, on September 12, 1922, Molly's older sister, Albina, came to visit Molly, who was now confined to her room at a boarding house. Albina tried to put on a brave face, but as soon as she walked inside, she was overcome with emotion, because her little sister barely even looked like a person anymore. She basically looked like a living skeleton. Molly had lost all of her teeth and her lower jaw, she could barely eat, and her body was basically wasting away. Her bones looked like they were trying to rip their way out of her skin. Albina looked into her little sister's eyes, and she could see that Molly was suffering. It was like she was trapped inside of this body that was just failing her, and nobody knew why, so nobody could help her. Albina sat down next to Molly and held her hand. She stared down at her sister's skinny fingers while she told Molly what was going on with their parents and their other sisters, and how much everybody loved her and missed her. And then, Albina heard a gurgling sound. She looked up and saw blood pouring from what was left of Molly's mouth. Albina jumped up and ran to find a doctor, but by the time she and the doctor got back, there was blood all over Molly, her eyes were glassy, and she wasn't breathing. She was dead. Albina just stood there, frozen in shock. Later, Molly's parents and other sisters joined Albina at the boarding house, where Dr. Neff would finally inform them that Molly had died of syphilis. Albina and the rest of her family couldn't believe it. 5 years later, on October 15, 1927, Albina, her sister's husbands, and her father went to the cemetery where Molly was buried. And Albina's stomach twisted with nerves, because they were not going there just to visit her little sister's grave. As they neared the cemetery, Albina saw a well-dressed group of men gathered by the entrance. She knew they were all doctors and lawyers who were there to witness the same thing that she and her family were. Albina, her relatives, and this big group of men walked through the cemetery gates, past dozens of gravestones, until they reached the spot where Molly was buried. And then, the men began to dig Molly up. Albina was terrified of what her sister's body might look like, but she knew exhuming Molly was necessary. Because in the years since Molly's death, dozens of women who worked at that watch painting studio had gotten sick with the exact same symptoms that Molly had. Several had become severely disfigured or died. And even though the owner of the studio insisted the women's health problems had nothing to do with their work, the women didn't believe it. It seemed impossible to deny that something in that studio was making them all sick. So, 5 of these women had banded together, lawyered up, and were attempting to sue the studio. But to make their case, they needed to prove a direct connection between the women's work and their illnesses. They hoped Molly's remains could give them that proof. Albina watched as the men used ropes and chains to lift Molly's coffin out of the ground. Once it was out, they slowly pried open the lid. And as soon as Albina saw her little sister's body, she gasped. Molly's skeleton was glowing. Molly's remains were brought to a medical examiner's office for an autopsy, and it was quickly determined that she did not die of syphilis. She'd never actually had syphilis at all. It turned out Dr. Neff had performed the syphilis test incorrectly and gotten a false positive result. However, the doctors and lawyers overseeing the autopsy had a hunch about what did kill Molly. It was the glow-in-the-dark paint that she and the other women at the studio used. They knew this paint contained a specific chemical element, which was what made it glow. The general public believed this element was safe. In fact, it was often prescribed as a medication, added to beauty products, and even put in toothpaste. Molly and the other women at the studio knew this element was in the paint, and they also knew they sometimes ingested a small amount of it during their workday. Because, as Molly was told during her onboarding, one of the big issues with the paintbrushes is the bristles would begin to flatten out over time. And so it was important, as a painter, to make sure the points on those brushes were sharp. And so the women had developed this technique called lip pointing, where they would take the paintbrush and they would put it in their mouth and tighten their lips around it to tighten the bristles, and then dip it in the paint and paint the watch. But each time they did that, there was always a little bit of the paint still on the brush that would go into their mouth and be ingested. Now, some women thought that maybe ingesting this element might be good for them, while others were a bit more hesitant and actually asked if the paint was safe. And their supervisors would always tell them that yes, it was. However, scientists and the owner of the studio knew that was not true. In reality, the element was extremely dangerous, and it was becoming increasingly obvious as more women from the watch painting studio became desperately ill. So, at this point, the doctors and lawyers wanted to prove that Molly's body contained a lethal amount of the element found in the paint. To do this, they performed a test that involved burning Molly's bones to ash, dissolving that ash in acid, and then checking for the element. And just as they'd thought, Molly's bones were full of radium. Radium is an incredibly toxic radioactive element. When it enters a person's body, it gradually destroys their bones and other tissues. In Molly's case, it caused her gums to swell, her teeth to fall out, and her jaw to fall off. Molly ultimately died because the radium poisoning ate through her jugular vein, which is one of the largest and most important veins in the body. This caused her to suddenly bleed to death. After it was proven that radium was killing the watch painters, The 5 women who filed the lawsuit all received settlement payments from their employer, the U.S. Radium Corporation. These included a lump sum plus an annual payment. However, these women did not really get to enjoy the settlement because eventually they all died of radium poisoning. Meanwhile, other similar studios continued operating in the United States. At least 50 women died as a direct result of radium exposure in these studios, including Catherine, the 15-year-old girl who had initially trained Molly and her sister, and Ella, Molly's friend who sat near her at the workbench, who showed her how she painted her nails with the radium. Eventually, another court case was filed, which led to better protections for people who worked with radioactive elements. However, by that point, it was already far too late for Molly and the other women who were unknowingly poisoned by their jobs, and who, to this day, still glow inside of their graves. On the morning of Friday, June 11th, 2021, in a suburb in the northwest of London, a man named David Klein woke up to his early morning alarm. David rolled out of bed, he got dressed, and he very carefully made his way downstairs to start getting ready for work. As David moved around this old brick house he was in, he was very careful not to make much noise because he didn't want to wake up his roommate, a 67-year-old widow named Deborah Chong. Deborah was technically David's landlord, but she didn't charge him any rent. The two had met in church, and when Deborah had learned that David didn't really have a place to live, she had immediately volunteered her house and told David to come live with her for free. David couldn't believe her generosity and immediately took her up on the offer. And then after he had moved in, he learned that he was far from the first person who Deborah had allowed to come and live in her house rent-free. It would turn out Deborah, whose late husband had given her a ton of money in his will, felt like it was her responsibility and her duty to use her ample resources to house people that were kind of down on their luck. She said it was her way of serving God. Also, David got the impression that Deborah just liked having people living with her in her home. It made her happy. But David would notice a distinct change in Deborah's personality around the time the COVID-19 pandemic started in early 2020. At that time, Deborah, like many other people, was very concerned about this global health crisis and wanted to learn more about what was happening and what could happen in the future. And so the way she did that is she obsessively began going on YouTube and began consuming COVID-19 related content and political content surrounding COVID-19 and the pandemic and lockdowns. But instead of becoming more educated and well-versed on what was happening in the world, Deborah's constant consumption of COVID-19 related content on YouTube really just made her feel incredibly stressed out and anxious. And as David began to see firsthand, Deborah's sudden high levels of anxiety really began wreaking havoc on her life. Years earlier, Deborah was officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which is a mental illness that causes bouts of psychosis, which is like losing touch with reality. Now, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, her symptoms were so mild that she basically led a totally normal life. But once the pandemic started and her YouTube quest for information caused that spike in stress and anxiety, it caused a spike in her symptoms. And so she began suffering from frequent and lengthy hallucinations and delusions. One time, David came home from work, and when he went inside the house, he found Deborah sitting at the kitchen table, diligently writing these handwritten letters to various British public figures. And when David asked her what she was doing, she explained to him that these British public figures were speaking directly to her through the YouTube videos she was watching, and so these handwritten letters were her response letters back to these public figures. In May of 2021, Deborah's hallucinations had gotten so bad that doctors intervened and forcibly injected her with an antipsychotic medication. And while these meds definitely reduced Deborah's symptoms, they also had some pretty negative side effects as well. Namely, they totally curbed her appetite and they made sleeping really challenging. And so pretty quickly, those two side effects combined made Deborah feel really weak and tired basically all the time, to the point where she sometimes needed David to literally hold her up by her arm just to walk down the street. Now, David, of course, had no problem helping Deborah with whatever she wanted. I mean, she had done so much for him, But David had work, and so he was only really available to help her in the mornings and in the evenings during the week. And so he had actually spoken to Deborah about hiring a full-time caretaker that could live with her and just take care of her at the level she needed all the time. And Deborah was open to it. She actually called a company that offered that service, and they told her they would get someone out to her, but it would take some time before her caretaker was actually assigned to her. Now, David was really pleased with this development, but he really wished they would speed it up, because again, every time he was away all day at work, he knew Deborah was home by herself, and so he was just so worried something was going to happen to her when he was gone. So after David gathered up all of his things and very quietly made his way from the kitchen to the front door, he paused for a moment and said a silent prayer in his head for Deborah's safety and protection while he was away at work, and then he opened the front door, quietly went outside, shut the door behind him, and headed off to work. A few hours later, David came home from work, he went back inside of the house, and the first thing he did is he called out for Deborah. But Deborah didn't call back, and the house was very quiet, and so David took off his shoes and walked around the first floor, kind of calling out for Deborah as he walked, but again, there was no answer. And so after walking the whole first floor and not finding her, he yelled one more time really loudly, "Hey, Deborah, are you here?" And after hearing nothing, he pulled out his phone and he called Deborah. And as the phone was ringing, he could hear Deborah's phone ringing upstairs. And so he thought, okay, maybe Deborah is upstairs, she fell asleep, and her phone's just next to her on the bed. And so with David's phone still calling Deborah's phone, David began walking upstairs. And when he got to the top of the stairs, he just followed the sound of Deborah's ringing phone into her bedroom. And when he went in there, Deborah was not in there. Her phone was though, and so were her glasses. They were both just sitting on the bed. Those were two items that Deborah would bring with her anywhere she went. And so trying not to panic, David called out a few more times for Deborah, but again, there was no answer. And so after quickly searching her bedroom and not finding her, he searched all the other rooms upstairs, but again, she just was not there. She was not in the house. And so David began calling and texting friends from church and other people that knew Deborah to see if anybody had heard from her or knew where she was. But no one did, and the only people who had recently talked to her said she was totally incoherent, talking about spirits and demons and the destruction of all mankind. And so, believing Deborah must be suffering from a schizophrenic hallucination somewhere out in the city, David picked up his phone again and he called the police. When the police showed up at the house, David filled them in on what was going on, and the police told him, hey, look, we'll go back and review all of the CCTV camera footage taken from outside of your house. We're bound to see footage of Deborah leaving her house at some point, and then we can just watch where she goes. And so David felt reassured, and the police felt very confident, but when the police went back to the station and began reviewing all of this security footage taken from roughly outside of Deborah's house, there was no footage of her ever leaving the house. There was only footage the day before of Deborah going into the house, but she never left. And so naturally, the police went back to Deborah and David's house, and they thoroughly searched that house, believing Deborah had to be in there somewhere. But despite searching everywhere in this house, in every crawl space, in the attic, the basement, every closet, everywhere, she wasn't there. It would take the police nearly a month, but they would eventually figure out where Deborah went. And to say they were surprised at where she went is a massive understatement. But to understand what happened, we have to go back to the very beginning of Deborah's very strange disappearance story. It all started about 10 months before Deborah actually went missing in August of 2020. That month, Deborah met a 36-year-old woman named Gemma Mitchell at one of her church prayer groups. Like Deborah, Gemma was very religious, and so the two women became fast friends despite being 30 years apart in age. Deborah would confide in Gemma about her mental health struggles, and Gemma would confide in Deborah about her house/financial troubles. Basically, Gemma, a couple years earlier, had given money to a contractor to fix up her house, but the contractor had taken her money, not done any work, and then run off, basically robbing Gemma. But Gemma really needed to do these renovations, and so she wound up hiring a second contractor who did begin work, but during this process, Gemma realized she would never be able to recover the money that was stolen from her from the first contractor, and so when she realized she wasn't going to get that money, she knew she would not be able to fully pay the second contractor for his work. And so when the second contractor found out he was not going to get paid, he stopped work immediately, despite the fact that there was no working heat in Gemma's house, and there was a huge hole in her roof. But Gemma had no way to fix this, and so she and her mom were just living in this house that was just totally freezing all the time. Deborah had been so moved by Gemma's situation that very quickly after meeting her, she offered £200,000 to Gemma to finish the renovations on her house, under the condition that one room in Gemma's new house would be solely dedicated to Christian ministry. Gemma was overwhelmed with gratitude. She could not believe that Deborah was willing to do this for her. And so, of course, she agreed to her terms without any hesitation. After that, the two women began texting all the time about this renovation project. Deborah would suggest paint colors and different things to do with the inside of the house, and Gemma would text updates about the different contractors she had talked to who could do pieces of the renovation. Deborah was always inviting Gemma over to her house, and she even began referring to Gemma as her sister. And Gemma loved it, because Gemma actually had always wanted to be much closer with her own biological sister, but they had kind of drifted apart. And so for Gemma, Deborah really did feel like the sister she was supposed to have. But their relationship was about to change drastically. In May of 2021, so 8 months after the two women met for the first time, and 1 month before Deborah would vanish, Deborah was forcibly injected with that antipsychotic medication in order to combat her paranoid schizophrenia. And right after Deborah got this injection, she began treating Gemma totally differently. She basically stopped communicating altogether with Gemma, and then in the rare times she would text Gemma, it was just to berate her about being a hoarder or being too messy and sloppy. Gemma didn't really know what to make of her friend's new behavior, but she knew, Deborah was going through a really tough time, and so Gemma just kind of took the abuse and didn't say anything. When Gemma did try to talk to Deborah by asking about the renovation project, which was quickly approaching on the horizon, Deborah would tell Gemma not to talk about it, that it was too stressful and just don't bring it up again. And then one day, Deborah just called Gemma out of the blue and said, "I'm not funding the renovation anymore, it's over, you're on your own." Gemma felt totally devastated and pleaded with Deborah to please reconsider. But Deborah was not about to change her mind, and in fact, on this call, she would tell Gemma, hey, you should just sell your house. And in fact, until you sell your house, don't contact me. And then Deborah hung up. Gemma didn't know what to do. She felt like she really could not sell her house because it was kind of like a family heirloom that had been passed down for generations, and so it just felt wrong to sell it. But on the other hand, without help, she would never have enough money to fix the house up. And so she was totally stuck, and she felt like her only option was to go to Deborah and have one more conversation and just really plead her case and see if maybe there was some chance Deborah would change her mind. So, on the morning of June 11th, 2021, so this is the day that Deborah goes missing, Gemma showed up on Deborah's porch and rang her doorbell. She arrived just after David had left for work. A few moments later, Deborah slowly made her way to the door. She opened it up. She saw Gemma out there and asked, what's going on? And Gemma just very politely said, "Would you please let me come in? And can we just talk one more time about the renovation?" And Deborah, who was not very enthused at the idea of having this conversation, said, "You know what? Okay, come on in." And so Gemma would go inside, and the two women would go sit down, and they'd exchange some pleasantries. And then at some point, when there was a break in the conversation, Gemma brought up the renovation. She had actually written out this whole speech about how incredible Deborah was, and how these renovations, if they went through with them, would mean so much to her, Gemma, and her family. But as Gemma is going through this pitch, Deborah just cuts her off and says, "Gemma, I'm sorry, but my decision is final. I am not paying for the renovation. I'm sorry." A little while later, both Gemma and Deborah would leave Deborah's house. And there actually is CCTV footage that shows the pair walking on Deborah's street right outside of her house. However, the reason the police did not flag this footage when they first were scanning all of that footage to figure out where Deborah went is because when you watch the footage of the two women together, it actually only looks like one person. It looks like Gemma. But Gemma is wheeling a huge suitcase right behind her, and as it would turn out, Deborah was inside of it. It's assumed that after Deborah was forcibly given that antipsychotic medication for her paranoid schizophrenia, that it really leveled her out. She was suddenly thinking very clearly for the first time in months. And in this clear state of mind, it's believed she realized the 200,000-pound gift she was giving to Gemma, someone she barely knew, was a bad decision. And so she just wanted to back out of it. And so, back inside of Deborah's house, when Deborah and Gemma are sitting there, and Gemma is doing her speech to try to convince Deborah to change her mind, and Deborah is saying, no, my final answer is no, it's over, that's when Gemma snapped. She grabbed a blunt object, we don't know what it was, and she smashed Deborah right over the skull and fractured her skull, causing Deborah to fall unconscious and slump onto the floor. And then Gemma leapt on top of Deborah's unconscious body. Gemma pulled out a knife and cut Deborah's head off. And then afterward, Gemma cleaned up all the blood in the house and then stuffed Deborah's body and head into that big suitcase. And then after Gemma stole several legal documents and a copy of Deborah's will, she walked out of Deborah's house with Deborah in the suitcase behind her. Gemma would walk with Deborah all the way back to her house, and then she would leave the suitcase, with Deborah still inside of it, in her backyard. She would just leave it there for 2 weeks, and then after those 2 weeks, Gemma would take the suitcase again, still with Deborah's body inside of it, and transport it 250 miles away to a seaside town where she would dump it. And in that seaside town, some vacationers would discover Deborah's body and call it in to the police. On July 6th, 2021, police would arrest Gemma on suspicion of murder. When they arrested her, they showed up at her house and used a battering ram to smash in her front door. And then when the door finally literally smashed open, Gemma was just standing there waiting for the police as if she knew this was going to happen and she's just waiting to be taken away. When the police would actually go into Deborah's house and search it, they would find a fake copy of Deborah's will where all of Deborah's estate was handed over to Gemma and Gemma's mother. In October of 2022, Gemma was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. To this day, Gemma insists she did not kill Deborah. In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat. And at some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town. And unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zivana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zivana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Savannah disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Savannah's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Savannah was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Savannah lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Savannah had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Savannah was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Savannah's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Savannah appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Savannah murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Savannah's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Savannah running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Savannah, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Savannah. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Savannah was found murdered, Vlado published a story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A serial killer stalks Kosovo." In the story, Vlado says that Savannah's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Savannah, literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran, and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims, and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Savannah had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown up front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just totally silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go, and then the door slowly opened up, and this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch, and the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother, i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zivana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zivana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zivana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zivana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zivana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. When the Earth collapses in on itself, creating a hole in the ground that sucks away anything in its wake, that's called a sinkhole. These holes form when water dissolves the rock layer underneath the soil. They range dramatically in size, from a barely noticeable depression in the ground to massive chasms that are hundreds of meters wide and deep. If you're one of the unfortunate few that falls into a large sinkhole, you probably won't get out again, because the ground inside of a sinkhole after the initial implosion just continues to sink. So if you were standing on the ground inside of a sinkhole, you would continuously be pulled into the ground as it continued to crumble and churn like quicksand below your feet. And even if you managed to get to the sides inside of the sinkhole, you could not climb up again because there wouldn't be any handholds because the soil is all loose and wet. Luckily, most sinkholes form slowly and show lots of warning signs, allowing people to get away before it opens up. But there are unique circumstances where large sinkholes can appear out of nowhere. In Russia, hot water is piped into business and residential buildings during the harsh winters. On November 19th, 2019, in the Russian city of Penza, which is 340 miles south of Moscow, a large hot water pipe burst underground below a car park. Initially, nobody knew the pipe had burst, but witnesses would later say they saw steam coming out of the ground near the car park, but they didn't think anything of it. A few minutes after the steam appeared, 49-year-old Vladimir Volyelkin was driving his car through the car park. With him was his co-worker, 53-year-old Igor Chikasov. They worked together at a furniture store. As they made their way towards the exit of this car park, there was another car ahead of them that rolled over that section of pavement that was steaming, and they watched as it rolled over and drove off, and nothing happened. And so Vladimir and Igor, they drove over that section of pavement and the ground collapsed under them. The burst hot water pipe had injected thousands of gallons of water into the soil right under the pavement, and so it caused a sinkhole. But not just any sinkhole, a sinkhole that was slowly filling with boiling water. When the ground collapsed under Igor's car, it flipped the car forward and it landed upside down at the bottom of this 10-meter deep sinkhole. And it landed just perfectly to where the doors could not open. They would hit the sides of the sinkhole, which also meant they couldn't roll the windows down and crawl out because they would hit the sides of the sinkhole. The men managed to get their seatbelts off and flip themselves around and began kicking on the windshield and yelling out for help. At this point, onlookers had made it to the edge of the sinkhole, and when they looked down inside, they realized there was nothing anyone could do. Jumping in was a death sentence. So they watched in horror as Vladimir and Igor desperately tried to escape, but the scalding water continued to fill the hole until it began leaking into the cabin of the vehicle, at which point the men went quiet. A few moments later, the car completely disappeared from view under the boiling water. Although not held criminally responsible, the water company that owned the pipe that burst offered to pay compensation to both families as well as cover all funeral costs. The northern end of New Zealand's South Island is a chaos of bays and sounds, and within this intricate coastline lies a narrow stretch of water called the French Pass, and it has a deadly secret. In 1827, French Admiral Jules d'Urville was mapping the coastline of South Island when he instructed his navigator to enter the pass. As d'Urville's crew was entering the narrowest section of the pass, they lost control of their ship and they began spinning. They eventually hit some rocks which cracked their hull, but luckily they came to rest on a nearby reef which prevented them from sinking. After the incident, d'Urville went back to France, and in his report, he said no one should enter the French Pass unless in an emergency situation, because as d'Urville and his crew learned firsthand, the French Pass is home to some of the world's most deadly whirlpools, which are exactly like the swirling tubes of water going down your drain after a bath, but these are just much larger and will kill you. Now, these French Pass whirlpools are only really dangerous when the tides are actively changing, because during that time, a current rips through the waterway that increases the speed and violence of the whirlpool. Once the transition is complete and it becomes fully high tide or fully low tide, or even during slack tide, the current slows down so dramatically that the whirlpools more or less vanish. So today, mariners do go through the French Pass, but they'll only go through during high, low, or slack tide. If they miscalculate the tides and get caught in a whirlpool, they could be dragged over the rocks, just like Admiral d'Urville and his crew. Now, while sailing through the pass is certainly hazardous, it's nothing compared to the risks of scuba diving through the pass. If a scuba diver mistimes the tides and gets sucked into a whirlpool, they won't get dragged over the rocks. They'll get pulled straight down to the bottom, where they'll be funneled into these ultra-deep holes that line the sea floor. The deepest of these holes is called Jacob's Hole, and it goes down over 100 meters. On March 10th, 2000, 7 experienced divers headed out to the French Pass to begin their 5th week of instruction in their Dive Master course. With a Dive Master certification, they would become professional divers. This day, as part of their curriculum, they needed to complete what's called a drift dive, where instead of trying to fight the current, you simply go with with it. These 7 divers, which were 6 students and 1 instructor, would all be tethered to the same 30-meter long line that had handholds evenly spaced throughout it. On one end of this line was attached a buoy, and then connected to the buoy was an inflatable raft. This allowed surface observers in the boat to track the progress of the dive. The plan was to boat out to the middle of the pass during high tide, jump in the water, and then ride the slow current out of the pass again, avoiding all the whirlpools. So, at high tide, a boat took the 7 divers out to the middle of the pass. They all sat on the edge of the boat with their fins hanging off towards the side of the water. They clipped into that line, made sure their gear was good to go. They looked at each other, gave the OK symbol. They jumped into the water. As soon as they hit the water, they removed all the air from their compensators and their life jackets, and then when they were ready, they looked at each other, gave the thumbs down, and they went subsurface. One of these student divers' husbands, a man named Hallett Smith, who had previously completed the Dive Master course, was in the boat as a safety observer. And he said as soon as the group got in the water and they went subsurface, immediately their buoy and raft took off at a rapid pace. Smith had to tell the boat driver to speed up just to keep pace with the divers, but after only a minute or two, the divers appeared to just stop suddenly in the water, and the inflatable raft started spinning in circles. When they drove over to the raft to see what was going on, Smith looked down and realized what had happened. The buoy and the line attached to it that all the divers were holding onto had ripped off of the inflatable raft and been sucked under the surface out of view. It would turn out the lead instructor had gotten the tides wrong and nobody had noticed. When the divers jumped into the water, it was not high tide like the instructor said it would be. It was changing from high tide to low tide, which meant instead of there being a 1 or 2 knot current, perfect for a drift dive, there was a 6 knot current ripping through the waterway that sucked them under. And for reference, any current that's above 3 knots is basically physically impossible to swim out of. So all these divers could do was ride it out and hope the current spat them out before pushing them into a whirlpool. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. All 7 divers were pulled directly into the worst whirlpool of all because it sat over Jacob's hole, and down they went, all the way down to 100 meters at the bottom of this hole where they were pinned until eventually the whirlpool began releasing them. Back on the surface, Smith, along with the other rescue boats he had called in once he realized this was an emergency, began hauling the divers out of the water one by one when they popped up on the surface, floating face down. 6 divers surfaced. 4 were badly shaken up, but were alive. One of them was the lead instructor. 2 had drowned. That was 40-year-old Ricky McDonald and Smith's wife, 33-year-old Narelle Tapuri. As for the 7th and final diver, 21-year-old David Welsh, his body was never found. So that's led some people to believe he may still be trapped at the bottom of Jacob's hole. The lead instructor who had gotten the tides wrong and the dive shop that employed him were both charged with negligence and had to pay a fine. After the accident, there was a big push to ban scuba diving in the French Pass, but it didn't hold. Today, it's up to each diver to make sure they never go in the pass when the tides are changing. Pelican Valley is a beautiful, remote section of backcountry in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Its meandering meadows and creeks and 360-degree view of the mountains make it appear like the perfect place to camp out under the stars. But unlike other areas of the park, Pelican Valley requires a special permit if you intend to stay the night. And before Yellowstone Park rangers give you this permit, they remind you that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place. And in general, you should only be out there with groups of at least 4 people. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen, along with her brother Andreas and her sister-in-law Junko, arrived at Yellowstone National Park. That night, they stayed in one of the park's more established campgrounds called Grant Village. The following day, they headed out to one of the park's famous hot springs called the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, before heading back to their campsite, they made a pit stop at the park ranger's office so Brigitte could apply for a Pelican Valley permit. Her plan was to spend the following night in the valley. When they went in the office, the rangers believed all 3 of them were applying for a permit, and so they weren't asking that many questions. They were just kind of going through the routine. And then when Brigitte said, "No, it's just going to be me applying for a permit," they actually immediately tried to dissuade her and said, "This is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own." but Brigitte assured them that she was an experienced camper, she understood the risks, and she still wanted to go on her own. And Andreas and Janko, who were standing behind her, kind of echoed that sentiment and said, no, she's really good, she knows what she's doing. The park rangers were not thrilled with her plan, but they ultimately decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. They just asked her to show them on a map where she intended to camp, so if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. And so she pointed to a section on the map, and they handed her her permit, and then she, along with Andreas and Janko, left the office and headed back to their campsite. The next morning, the trio got up early, and they hopped in the car and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. They parked their car, they got out, and they began walking into Pelican Valley as a group. After a few miles, as planned, the group stopped, at which point Andreas told Brigitte that they were going to head back now and that they would meet her tomorrow at the trailhead where they parked the car. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Janko turned around and started walking back towards the car, and Brigitte carried on into the wilderness. The following day, Andreas and Janko arrived at the trailhead to meet Brigitte, but she didn't show up. And after a couple of hours, they grew very concerned, so they called park rangers and asked them, have you seen Brigitte? And they said no, but we'll go take a look. The area Brigitte had told park rangers she was going to be camping was inside of a densely forested area right next to a large meadow, which meant as park rangers came up to check on her, they would not actually be able to see her until they were practically right on top of her. So the park rangers made their way through the meadow and into the forest before they started yelling for Brigitte, but she didn't yell back, and then at some point they reached the area where she had said she was camping, and sure enough they found her tent. But it was a very odd scene. When they came up to the tent, they could see there was a big tear in one side. When they poked their heads down and looked inside, all of her belongings in the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat right in the middle, and then to the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones that she must have been listening to before bed. It had been left on until the batteries ran out. At the foot of the pad was her backpack, inside of which were all of her clothes that had been neatly packed inside of Ziploc bags to mask her scent. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide with a page flipped down that was a diagram of how to string your food up into the trees so no animals can get to it. The rangers looked around the backside of the tent about 2 meters away, and they found her sleeping bag perfectly flat on the ground as if it had been laid out to dry in the sun. But upon closer inspection, they found it had 2 puncture marks, one that was up near the neck of the bag and the other that was near the torso, but there was no blood on the bag. At this point, rangers started to speculate that this could have been an animal attack, but they were confused at the general tidiness of the scene. Typically, when an animal attacks a person, it looks like a bomb went off in the area where the attack occurred, and this campsite was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for clues and yelling out for Brigitte, they found a barely discernible drag tail a couple of meters away from the sleeping bag that was leading west into the forest and up a hill. And so the rangers started following this trail, and they got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigitte's cooler lying on the ground on its side, and whatever food had been in there was now gone. There was some string laying next to it, so it looked like it had been strung up in the trees, but someone or something had gotten it down. From the cooler, the rangers continue walking along this drag trail another 20 meters or so up a hill, where they discover a woman's sweater on the ground that's been torn up and there's blood on it. So at this point, the rangers get their rifles up and they keep walking another 40 meters up and over the hill down into this clearing in the woods where they find Brigitte, or what was left of her. No one knows exactly what happened to Brigitte, but the theory based on physical evidence is this. After setting up her campsite, Brigitte climbed inside of her tent, got inside of her sleeping bag, and then put her headphones on to listen to music. A little while later, a male grizzly bear discovered Brigitte's cooler strung up in the trees about 20 meters away. And apparently, Brigitte did not string it high enough because the bear was able to reach up and pull it down. After the bear ate the food inside of the cooler, it was still hungry, so it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed this bear was so accustomed to human traffic in the area that when he stumbled across Brigitte's tent, he wasn't scared. In fact, he thought, there's food inside of there. There's people I can eat. So this bear quietly lumbers over to the side of the tent. It reaches up and cuts the nylon with its paw, and then it puts its head inside and bites down on Brigitte's skull and begins dragging her away. There was no sign of a struggle in or near the tent, indicating that Brigitte was most likely asleep, or maybe she just could not hear the bear because she still had her headphones in. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Bay is considered so dangerous, because it's full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people do not understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on pinning them down and then getting them under their body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. This is a method that keeps the victim alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigida that investigators could not pinpoint a time of death. However, because this bear broke normal behavior and intentionally targeted a human, there's a good chance he savored that meal. Nicknamed the Great Gray-Green Greasy, the Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Phalaborwa sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Phalaborwa resident Mariska Buitendog, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, so as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, "Hey, who wants to come with me for a third time in?" And the group said, "No, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe." And she said, "I don't care, I'm going in for a third time." So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa. And many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River. And inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to cross this river. Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming is one of the most remarkable and beautiful places on Earth. Not only is it renowned for its biodiversity, which includes some incredibly resilient microbial organisms, it's also home to one of the world's so-called supervolcanoes. This supervolcano sits atop one of the world's largest magma bodies fueled by an upwelling plume of superheated material. This dynamic and violent subterranean plumbing means the water bodies at the surface, the famous Yellowstone hot springs, are highly acidic and incredibly hot. If you were to ignore the countless warnings around these hot springs telling you to stay away, do not go in the hot springs, if you were to ignore those and go in one, or more accurately, fall in one, this is what would happen to you. First, your body would register that your skin was bathing in waters exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. This would hurt like nothing you can possibly imagine. But it would only hurt as long as your nervous system was able to register pain, which would only be for about 1 minute or less. At this temperature, your skin would begin to quickly break down and disintegrate, and your blood vessels in your underlying dermis would rupture, causing rapid blood loss. Some underlying skin layers would not break down, but they would lose all of their water and become tough and blackened. And your underlying subcutaneous fat would bubble off as well. All in all, this is known as a full thickness burn, and it would occur in about 1 minute in these waters. Your nervous system would enter a state of shock and become irreversibly damaged, which would lead to most, if not all, of your organs to fail if the heat stress has not already done that to you. You would be dead within 2 to 3 minutes, and then at that point, the acidity of the water would take over. Within a few hours, your body, including your skeleton, would be completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. And for anyone who falls in but manages to climb out again before being dissolved, they are not out of the woods. Many of those people, unfortunately, will die hours, days, months later due to complications from the burns. On June 7, 2016, Colin Scott and his sister Sable went to Yellowstone to see the famous hot springs. The siblings were exploring the Norris Geyser Basin, which is the park's oldest and hottest thermal area, when they decided to leave the safety of the boardwalk and walk past all the signs telling them, do not leave the boardwalk, this is dangerous, turn around. They decided to walk past all of those and venture out off the course. They walked approximately 200 meters away from the path to the edge of a hot spring that was not really part of the main tour, and they were just standing there when Colin apparently tripped and fell into the hot spring. And his sister was just not able to do anything. She knew she couldn't go in after him, and he very quickly sunk below the surface and didn't come up again. She ran back to try to get help, but by the time they got back to the edge of the hot spring, he was gone. And in fact, the only thing they would find of Colin Scott was his flip-flops. Since 1890, Colin Scott, along with 21 other people, have died by falling into these hot springs. There is a remote cliff face in northern England that rarely gets tourists. If you were standing in front of it, you would see this little stream that went into a break in the limestone. It's this little tiny hole, and that stream is called the Mossdale Beck. If you crouched down and walked through that hole, you would be entering the Mossdale Caverns, which since 1967 have been permanently sealed off to cavers. Once inside the Mossdale Caverns entranceway, you could look down and see that little stream, the Mossdale Beck, would be going between your legs, and then right in front of you, it would split in 2 distinct directions down respective tunnels. To the right, the water flows down 7 miles of accessible passageway. However, most of it is incredibly tight and it's prone to flooding. As a result, fewer people have seen the far reaches of the right side of Mossdale Cavern than have stepped on the moon. To the left, the water goes through these impenetrable rocks that no one has gotten past. In fact, no one knows what's beyond these rocks. However, scientists have determined the water that goes left at the entranceway will reemerge 18 days later, 5 miles away, 900 feet lower in a pool called the Black Keld. The massive tunnel system that we know exists but has yet to be explored that connects the entranceway to Black Keld is referred to as the missing link. You would think cavers from all over the world would be clamoring to get inside that accessible side, the right side of Mossdale Caverns, and try to find a secret access point back to the missing link, to be the first person to discover that, to stake your claim and say, that was me. But in fact, since the Mossdale Caverns was discovered in 1941 until 1967, almost no one went in Mossdale Caverns. Endless, tight, water-filled crawls with names like Drown or Glory made Mossdale Caverns feel like too big of a risk to be worth it. But in 1967, 10 extremely fit, extremely experienced cavers said, you know what? We are going in Mossdale Cavern and we are going to find that entrance to the missing link. So on June 24th, 1967, these 10 cavers entered Mossdale Caverns. They went right into the accessible 7 miles of passageway and they began their descent. And it wasn't that long until 2 of the 10 cavers, the 2 least experienced of the group, said, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. Got a bad feeling about this, but we don't know the way out. And so they needed chaperones to leave. And so 2 other cavers from the group had to go with them. So 4 cavers, they leave Mossdale Caverns. The other 6 are going to continue on. So when the 4 got back to the surface, it was about 5 p.m. They had been in the cavern for several hours at this point. And when they went in initially, the weather was great. It was beautiful. It was clear. Now they're coming out again and it had started to rain. Not significantly. It was more like a drizzle. But they were a little bit concerned because they knew the other 6 were planning to be in the cavern until after midnight. So they were just hopeful that the rain did not get any worse. But just a couple of hours later, the skies opened up and it rained like it hadn't rained in years. Just torrential downpour. And the 4 were really concerned about the other 6. So they went back to the entrance hoping that maybe, the other 6 would have heard the rain, although it's very unlikely considering how deep they were going to be. But they were hoping that maybe they'd be coming out again and they would see them and get them back to safety. But when they arrived there, not only were the 6 not out of the cave, but the actual entrance to the cave was completely submerged in water. Earlier that day, when the 4 cavers turned around and left, the other 6 cavers, they continued on, and they had made it about 2 miles deep into these caves. They had passed the fabled drown or glory swim, they had survived the knee-wrecker passage, and they had bit their tongue as they squeezed through the famously painful Umaguli tunnel, now located hours away from the only way out. So they are way into this cave. They were nearing the end of this distant section of the cave that they believed on the other end they would find this hidden entrance into the missing link. All they had to do was pass through the far marathon section, which is a 900-foot tunnel that is only 10 inches high, 2 feet wide, and you have to wriggle through on your stomach with your face pressed against a stream that runs through it. And it takes a very long time to get through it. It's incredibly claustrophobia inducing. It's considered one of the most stressful things you can do in caving. But considering how experienced these cavers were and the fact that they had come down there specifically to get to this far point in the cave, you got to figure that their spirits were high. They were probably joking with each other as they're doing this awful thing. And then they made it about 3/4 of the way through this tunnel when someone must have noticed the distant rumbling sound and said, "Hey, what is that?" And as they sat there listening, trying to discern what the sound was, it must have dawned on them that their worst nightmare was about to come true. That was the sound of surging water. This tunnel is about to flood. They began crawling faster and faster down the marathon tunnel. Not only was it very difficult to move quickly inside of this very tight tunnel, but they also knew there was nowhere to go. They're 2 miles underground. They must have felt like the world of sunshine and fresh air was suddenly an eternity away. The oldest of the group was 26. The rest of them were all in their teens. United now by fear, the water came rushing in as they're all pinned inside of the far marathon tunnel, and their face is already up against the river, and now this river is surging with water. And so they're all desperately trying to crawl through this flooding tunnel, and the leader of the group, the guy literally in the front, John Ogden, who was 26, he managed to get all the way through the far marathon tunnel to the space where they anticipated finding that secret entrance into the missing link. That wasn't there, but he found above him there was a small fissure in the rocks. There was an air pocket, and he managed to get his head up into the space right as the water in the far marathon cave completely submerged. So any of the cavers in there, they drowned inside of the far marathon. The bubble that he was in was a little bit bigger, and so some of the cavers managed to get in there, and they tried to clamber into this air pocket as well, but ultimately there was only enough room for one person, and John was the only one up there. And so as the water levels filled the room he was in up to his neck, everyone below John drowned. Now, we don't know if John literally kept other people from getting into this air pocket with him. All we know is it could only hold one person, and ultimately John was the one who was left inside of this crevice. But this air pocket was really just delaying the inevitable because there wasn't very much air inside of it, and John's 2 miles below the surface. There is no way anyone is going to get to him in time. And so he ended up dying a couple days later, and when they found him, he was still in the air pocket trying to get one last breath. What I've not covered in this story that I would encourage you all to check out is there was this incredible effort to try to save these cavers before anyone knew they were deceased. There was this hope that maybe they found an air pocket and they were still alive. And so they basically created this artificial dam that was very precarious. The water could at any moment spill over, and it provided just enough drainage inside of this cavern for some of the best cavers in the world to go into the cavern to look for them. And so they went into this cavern knowing at any minute that makeshift dam on the surface could break and they will 100% drown in here. No one's coming to get them. They had to crawl through the far marathon tunnel all the way down at the bottom to get to the lost cavers. And ultimately, when they discovered they were all deceased, it would have been impossible to remove their bodies. And so the decision was made to leave the 6 cavers where they died and seal off the cave permanently. So in 1967, they sealed it off, and they now treat Mossdale Caverns like a gravesite, and no one goes in it. So that's going to do it, guys.
Through the day, we dream so
Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go over to the like button's house and ask to play hide and seek. When the like button is hiding, switch their regular coffee with decaf coffee, and then do not seek the like button, just leave. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even